It's my pleasure to introduce somebody who I met only today, but who I feel like I've sort of at least known a little bit because I've been reading so much about the research that he's been doing. And he's rocking a lot of information on what's happening out there with different versions of content, whether it's preprints or articles, how they're being used, how they're interrelated, and how they're working together. So it's my pleasure to introduce Casey Greene.
So thank you for the introduction. I'm on Twitter if you want to take a look at my Twitter account. The slides are actually posted there if you want to follow along on the slides that way. If you find that sort of links are a pain to look at, because then you can't actually access them. And there'll be a QR code later, so if you really like QR codes, get ready. Okay, so my talk is essentially about parasites in science, and so this is sort of people who use other people's, for instance, data or literature. And I really like highlighting this letter from Newton to Hooke that says, if I have seen further, it's up here, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, because essentially this is what we do in science, right? We look at what other people have done, we develop hypotheses from that, and then we test those hypotheses. And organizations like Crossref and the publishers who are here, I think the role of those organizations in an ideal world is to facilitate exactly this type of work. And I think that's not always universally seen as a positive. So this was an editorial from the New England Journal of Medicine in January of last year, where they mentioned there's a group of people called research parasites. And if you read this, what you find is that research parasites are really horrible people, because they do things like use another group's data for their own ends, possibly stealing from the research productivity planned by the data gatherers, as if sort of gathering the data automatically means you should be the only one to draw insights from that. And particularly in this case where we're talking about clinical data, where basically participants have joined a study to help other people to say, reusing that data to discover something new about a disease earlier is a problem. I don't know, to me this just rubbed me horribly the wrong way. And so we, being an assistant professor with no actual power, I did the only thing I had access to, which is I had a lab website. And so I edited the lab website to create the Parasite Awards, which are awards given to people who use someone else's data to do some really cool stuff. And so we gave these out last year, and so we had two winners. We had a junior parasite and a senior parasite. So the junior parasite was Kunsei Yu from, at the time, Stanford, and now he's at Harvard, who reused TCGA's imaging data in a really interesting way. And our senior parasite was Eric Turner, who has some really interesting work looking at publication bias in clinical trials. So I know this came up earlier. How horrible is it that a lot of clinical trials don't get published? Well, what Eric found is that if you look at the published clinical trials, they're usually the positive ones. And if you look at the clinical trials that don't get published, they're often the ones that had sort of negative or unclear outcomes. So I think that type of work is particularly valuable, and it's the type of thing that might be sort of stealing productivity from the original investigators, but it's exactly the type of stealing that we need if we're going to improve what we know about human disease. And Eric also has a great sense of humor, so he got back and he tweeted, we gave out these little lamprey statues that have a magnetic head, so you can stick them to something that's ferromagnetic. And so he converted the lamprey into a lamprey, which I thought was pretty clever. And now I've got a bunch of these. So the Research Parasite Awards, it turns out, are not a one-time thing. So they're back again this year, and we'll have them in perpetuity, actually. We have an endowment, which is wild. So we put out a call again this year in April. The deadline was September, and we've now got our winner selected. So stay tuned. On January 4th, you might hear about the winner of the Research Parasite Awards. It gets announced at PSB, so it should be around afternoon Hawaii time. And if you want to learn more, you can go to researchparasite.com. And there's now a companion award for people who shared data called the Research Symbiont Award. So that's also available if you have shared data that people have reused. And I think we can all probably agree that there's certain types of parasites that we like, and these are the research parasites who download someone else's data and use it to do something really cool. And then there's other types of parasites that we're a little more worried about, especially in this crowd. And so this is a paper where they named a parasitoid wasp, Idiogramma albachiani. Sorry, that's a horrible pronunciation of the name. So those of you in the crowd who have heard of a certain website where people share papers might be familiar with this paper and this name, because it turns out that it's named after the creator of Sci-Hub. And if we think about parasites, in some ways, Sci-Hub, I assume this is not too controversial in this audience, has some parallels to the sort of data sharing. And actually, I think it has some parallels in the way that might be a little less comfortable, which is that if we want data to be available, wanting literature to be available may not be that unreasonable. And so we were kind of interested in this, particularly because Sci-Hub on the 19th of March of this year tweeted out, oh, if you'd like the list of all the DOIs that we have, here's the list. And so this happened on the 19th of March. And by the 20th of March, our lab had a GitHub repository that was actually starting to do some analysis of what is actually available in Sci-Hub. And what we ended up finding, this is probably not going to surprise most of the publishers in the audience, there's a lot of papers in Sci-Hub. So if you look at the total coverage, it's nearly 90% of the toll access literature. And lest you think that Sci-Hub is simply an easy way to obtain access to papers, and so both open access and toll access papers will be represented in equal amounts. That turns out not to be true. The open access literature is actually pretty well covered, but not nearly to the same extent as the toll access literature. And we wanted to make this pretty easy to work with, so those of you who love QR codes, here's your chance. So we created a journal browser. So if you have a journal that you're really interested in, you can go in and you can see what proportion of papers in that journal published in each year are available in Sci-Hub. So there are some journals, like this one, the New England Journal of Medicine, that I sort of led off with, where the coverage is quite high. So if there's an article you're interested in, it's very likely to be available in Sci-Hub. And we've actually got a browser. So for a period of time in 2015 and 2016, we actually have request logs, so we know what articles people requested. And what we found is that you can actually look at the articles that were requested for those published in 2014 and 2015 and get a reasonable idea of what people were interested in reading. And interestingly, if you look at journals like the New England Journal, it's a lot of review papers around like what diseases are and how to treat those diseases. So if you're thinking about how parasites fit in the overall sort of access to information that could help treat or cure a disease, the idea that people are using this type of resource to download instructions to learn about these diseases, particularly in a large number of countries, so presumably not just in the US, but in countries where this may be less accessible, maybe there's some bit of a point here. So just to dive a little bit deeper, I won't go too far because I want to leave time for questions because I suspect people will have some. We did a bunch of analysis. The most important bit of this is if you just consider the articles that are cited from the last couple years, Sci-Hub covers about 96.2% of recent citations. So while the coverage is actually just under 90% of the literature, for the things that are cited in toll access journals, it's more like above 95%. So their coverage is quite high. So my perspective, primarily as a researcher looking forward, what do I think the literature is going to look like in the future when it's not just a PDF? Because I think the era where controlling access to PDFs is a business model is probably not going to be one that's long for this world. So we really like literature that's open early, so we're big fans of preprints. We want to put papers out as soon as possible so we can find issues. I know not every journal agrees with this, so we tried to submit a paper to an AACR journal. I don't know if there's any people from AACR here. You've now changed this policy if you're here. But we basically got back, well, we don't consider any literature where there's been a preprint posted. And based on that, what I decided to do was, well, I'm not going to work for free for you anymore. So if you're not going to if you're not going to publish, if you're not going to consider papers with preprints posted, I will no longer review papers for your journal. And so I've declined to review a number of papers for journals. Again, AHA is another one. So I've gotten requests to review for hypertension, and I don't review for hypertension for this reason. And I think as scientists, for those of us in the audience who review papers, I think it's important to consider whether or not the journal you're reviewing for meets your ethics. So I have a postdoc who will not review for a journal that is not open access. And I think the future is going to be very collaborative. There's a number of platforms that are moving in this direction. We actually just wrote a paper over the last year or so on GitHub, and the entire paper is now available online. And if you go to this GitHub repository, Greene Lab/Deep Review, you can actually see the paper through its entire process of construction. And finally, I think it's important that versioning be involved, and in a really deep way. So it's really nice to see, version DOIs coming onto the scene and becoming widely used. So we published the first version of this preprint earlier this year, saying, Sci-Hub, and this is sort of V1. Finally, we estimate that over a 6-month period in 2015 to 2016, Sci-Hub provided access for 99.3% of valid incoming requests. We said, wow, that's really high. That's crazy. Then the Sci-Hub account on Twitter actually read this article and said, actually, these things that we called access logs are actually just resolved requests. So we only put those in the logs if the PDF was actually returned to the user. They said, oh, that's too bad. Now this number is no longer any good. We don't know the actual number, which is why we moved to the citation-based approach. But now our paper actually reads, in the first version of this study, we mistakenly treated the log events as requests rather than downloads. Fortunately, the paper was reviewed. And so I think the ability to have these versions, particularly with the ability to link to this kind of rich, supportive information, is going to be an important aspect of the publications that we want to write in the future. And finally, I think my lab actually started looking in a deeper way at Sci-Hub because we would actually want to compute over these things. So if we imagine we're standing on the shoulders of giants, where this is our giant, there's a bunch of papers that branch off of this and papers that branch off of those, each of which make some assertions. And fundamentally, we might learn something new. Maybe we find this paper, which we've based all our assumptions on, doesn't reproduce. Well, what we'd like to be able to do is propagate that through the biomedical literature so we can say, well, this paper's actually fine because it builds off some other part of it that's not affected, but this one's a little bit affected. And then as you keep going, now this one's actually really affected by this one's not so much, this one not at all. And this kind of rich information propagation, I think, is going to be really important to the publishing platforms that we are really interested in using in the future and that add a lot of value, even in an era where PDFs are ubiquitously available. So I want to leave a bunch of time for questions, so I'll thank the members of my lab. Primarily for this work, Daniel Himmelstein's the postdoc who drove the Sci-Hub project forward. And on the Sci-Hub study, since this was also done entirely on GitHub, we had some other people just randomly drop in, so Ariel, Stephen, and Bastian all kind of just joined the Sci-Hub study while it was being done, and they're now co-authors on it. Funding this work, the Sci-Hub work was primarily funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. We have support from other organizations as well. So I'd be happy to take any questions.
So the data parasites notion is very funny, and I think we all recognize that people produce data in order that the field can analyze it and build on it. That's what I would hope in this setting. We're among friends here. The Sci-Hub as a parasite, I have slightly more issue with. You might expect that. I work for a publishing company. So I wonder if you're trying to equate those things, or if you see them both as similar types of parasite. Let's put it that way.
I guess, what I would say is a lot of the arguments that I hear around clinical investigators not wanting to share the results of their clinical trials in a sort of deeper way that allows other people to reanalyze it is that possessing that data gives them some unique value proposition that they would lose if they had to share it. And I would say I wonder to what extent possessing copyright on a specific file is giving publishers the same type of value proposition. So, I know there's a lot of additional value added that goes on in the publishing process. I think there's also a lot of additional value added that goes on in the data, cleaning process. And, I think I was intentionally trying to draw maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable parallel because I think, now we kind of widely view the data parasites article or, research parasites article as as sort of an example of poor scientific practice. And I guess I personally am not entirely convinced that certain current models of publishing are not falling into the same approach. But I think there's, certainly a future we could reach that, it clearly adds value that's recoverable in different ways.
If I don't think data parasites will ever put data collectors out of business. It's a different. It's certainly in the fields I know best, genomics, for example. You can have data collectors and data analyzers. They don't have to be the same people. Publishers exist to do the publishing stuff and pay for some infrastructure and so on. And all I'm really saying is I hope there's some thought about what replaces the funding for the infrastructure and so on if you just get rid of the publishers, which is a legitimate aspiration. I don't object to it in principle.
Yeah, so I think I would say kind of two things on that. So one, I hear trialists often talk about how if they have to share their data, no one will run clinical trials anymore, which I'm skeptical of, but it seems to be a somewhat similar claim. The other thing I would say is, I think if you're a publisher right now and your competition is Sci-Hub, that's actually competition you want to have, because Sci-Hub is essentially a vehicle for delivering PDFs. And I personally don't think publishing this century is going to be about who can deliver PDFs. And so, I guess I would say, the question is, would you rather compete with Sci-Hub, or would you rather compete with a for-profit entity that's, got a better value proposition? And I think if you're competing with Sci-Hub, that's going to drive publishers to produce a new value proposition that might be more productive for everyone. I guess that's my take.
This is not so much a question as a comment. So there are some people who are, and they have done, produced papers of this form, that the papers are active documents. So, for example, it's not just a PDF, there's some fancy JavaScript in there, the data set is in there, and you can even query the data. Those papers are really cute, actually, very nice, and in fact, data parasites could just run queries on the data. However, it may also pose a question of who owns the data.
Yeah. So actually, I'm glad you.
By the way, some of people actually have toolkits to allow you to create PDFs that way.
Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that's a nice example of, I don't think Sci-Hub is likely to deliver that type of rich content. So if you're a publisher, delivering that that's additional value over the publishing system of the last century. And so I think that's the type of place where, there's unique value generated that can also be recovered. Let's see, who owns the data in that scenario? I do not know the answer for Singapore, but the answer of who owns data is a really interesting one from a copyright point of view. If data are facts, the specific type of data you've collected are facts, then in some jurisdictions they're not subject to copyright. But I think the licensing of data is a really important consideration, which I didn't really get into here, although the Research Symbiont Awards for data sharing do consider how freely you shared the data.
But the point here was that sometimes you embed the data into the paper.
Yeah, I mean, so whatever license the data is under will govern its use unless it's a set of facts. And again, only in certain jurisdictions.
So were any of the hosts, if that's the right word, invited to the award ceremony? And if so, what were their reactions?
So these people both parasitize very collective sets of hosts. So hundreds of different studies for the senior parasite and the TCGA project for the junior parasite. So I don't think either of those collectively expressed any displeasure. The Research Symbiont Award this year actually does aim to get sort of data sharers to the same venue. So that will also be announced at the same time on January 4th. So if you want to see symbionts, you can find them as well.
I just wanted to follow up on Theo's comment. I don't think Sci-Hub is in any way threatening publishing. It's threatening subscription publishing. But we have PLOS, BMJ itself has open access publishing, and Taylor and Francis this year switched 23 of their journals from hybrid to fully open access. 7 more are in process. And it's not just because of Sci-Hub, right? Gates Foundation requires open access. So I think the subscription model has maybe 10 or 30 years. We don't know how many sooner or later, but I don't think it's threatening publishing.
Yeah, that's true. I should have said, when I was using publishing before, I should have said toll access publishing. That's a good point.
Building on the shoulders of giants it very much resonates. As a researcher whose work has been built upon and who is very much advocating for this type of mechanism to advance the progress of science, can you talk a little bit about how you envision the distribution of credit or as it proceeds along the way? Any thoughts on how you as a researcher would like to be given credit?
Yeah, so I think, going, I think ultimately a really granular citation system is probably the answer. And, I think the reason we don't have such a granular system is, can you imagine asking researchers whenever they want to add a citation to put in, like, here's why I want to exactly, put this citation in. So I think doing it manually is not going to work, but automated systems that can parse a paper, identify an assertion, identify the citation that assertion comes from, sort of trace that assertion back to its origin. I think those types of systems are going to let us get better at apportioning credit. I also think this is an area where publishers can add a lot of value in terms of how richly they sort of pre-process and provide this additional information. I was chatting earlier with some people about, what if someone cites a paper that's been retracted, right? Like, think of the value you can add just by highlighting the sentence and the citation that come from a retracted paper. And that's not even technically that hard. So I think, these types of systems that you take advantage of citation to better identify where assertions are coming from will help us apportion credit in a way. But personally, I really like to see people use our stuff, because sometimes as a scientist it feels like you're just sort of shouting into the void. And when someone actually uses something you've done, then it's like, oh, this actually mattered. So it's kind of nice. Yeah. This is the widest aspect ratio room I've ever talked to.
Thanks for the overview. It was thought-provoking. Based on your analysis of the Sci-Hub data and your own role as a researcher, what recommendations would you have for publishers in order to maintain a sustainable practice going forward?
Yeah, so, personally, I think the toll access model is, I don't know, you said 10 to 30 years. I'd be surprised if in 5 years we're really following that model. So I think figuring out where you can add value that you can recapture in a model where the base literature itself is freely available is what I would suggest. And so that means sort of open access publishing charges, certainly. I think ways to provide an experience to readers on your website that doesn't sort of control access to the literature itself, but that controls access to the value that you add to that literature, like these types of sort of rich citation networks where, imagine every assertion in a paper, you could say, here's how credible I think this is based on the previous literature. Imagine how much easier that makes a paper to read, right? And so that type of thing also changes all the time. So it's not something that a website like Sci-Hub can make available to everyone. And so I think, a publishing world where maybe you control access to some of this rich metadata, or rich sort of overlay, but the base paper is essentially available to anyone. I think that to me feels like a model that adds a lot of new value and that is hard to lose in the way that sort of with BiblioLeaks, I think Sci-Hub is basically shown as going to happen for sort of the base PDF. I'm sure I'm the least popular speaker at a collection of publishers. Okay. Oh, okay.
Just a question, because you just mentioned about Kearney Sci-Hub. You just mentioned Kearney Sci-Hub is providing PDF.
Yeah.
I mean, can you foresee in the near future Sci-Hub provide other functionality which publisher can do? Then what will happen?
Yeah, so I guess I don't really, Sci-Hub's not a for-profit enterprise, right? I mean, Sci-Hub is essentially trying to eliminate toll access publishing. So I don't, I think if I were running a publisher, the thing what would really concern me would be organizations that are trying to build the same type of value on top of your product. So by kind of creating networks of users that kind of annotate and comment on this, I think that's, that in addition to some of these sort of machine-based analyses are going to add a lot of value. And so, I think if I were a publisher, that's what I'd be a lot more worried about, is the places that are sort of not controlling access to the PDFs, but that are controlling kind of or building these databases of kind of rich annotations. Personally, yeah, no, you can disagree. That's okay.
I think my point is now what I just heard from you is just Sci-Hub is just providing PDF, and then publisher can do many more, provide more functionality, more value add.
Yeah.
But what if one day Sci-Hub is good enough, they can provide the functionality or the value add, or we capture whatever the publisher do, but within Sci-Hub, what will happen?
So I don't think,
But you don't think that will happen at all, is it?
Given what we've seen with Sci-Hub, that doesn't appear to be where their interests lie. I mean, it's worth noting, it would be really hard to build a corporation on Sci-Hub at the moment, right? Because there's, the legal liabilities that they've incurred are becoming considerable. Could you imagine, asking someone to invest in your startup that starts with, negative $18 million in the bank? I mean, so I think actually, I think that if you're a publisher who needs to change their business model, I think worrying about Sci-Hub, yes, Sci-Hub is going to change certain business models, without a doubt. But the idea that Sci-Hub is going to be your biggest competitor, if Sci-Hub is your biggest competitor, I think probably you're not moving to the publisher model of the 21st century. So that would, okay. Thanks. Thank you.